everybody's passion for cars. I mean, race cars, show cars, any kind of cars.
The garage wasn't forgotten. It was sealed with purpose. When Murder Nova finally stepped inside, he didn't walk into memories or abandoned victories, but into a decision paused in time. A project left unfinished, not because it failed, but because continuing carried consequences. Every tool, every mark, every silence pointed to a moment when momentum was deliberately stopped. What waited behind that door wasn't history collecting dust. It was a truth that had been postponed until someone was ready to face it. The space left behind. From the outside, the garage looked harmless. A faded structure worn down by years of weather, its doors shut more from routine than any real security. For a long time, it lingered on the edges of Street Outlaws stories, mentioned occasionally, but never touched. When Murder Nova finally chose to open it, no one anticipated what waited behind those doors. The decision wasn't driven by curiosity or some planned reveal. It came out of necessity. Old equipment was needed, items long assumed to be outdated and forgotten. The expectation was straightforward. Layers of dust, corroded metal, and scraps from a past chapter. Instead, what greeted him was a silence that felt weighted and deliberate. Inside, time hadn't simply passed, it had stalled. Tools remained exactly where they had last been handled, not stored away, but left in mid-action. Parts were piled unevenly, some labeled with care, others left without identity. One project sat unfinished, frozen in progress, as if someone had stepped away intending to return the following day and never did. The air carried a strange scent. It wasn't decay, it was stillness. The kind that settles when something is shut down abruptly, not resolved. This wasn't a garage that had been retired, it had been closed. What unsettled Murder Nova wasn't any single artifact, but the collective evidence of abandoned momentum. Racing garages thrive on constant movement. Builds are revised, plans adjusted, parts reused. None of that had happened here. This space was locked in a moment no one wanted to confront again. As he moved farther in, details sharpened the discomfort. Measurements scrawled on masking tape, numbers written, erased, and rewritten. A setup log that ended suddenly without explanation. These weren't signs of normal change. They pointed to interruption. Slowly, the truth took shape. Whatever stopped this work hadn't been orderly. This garage was sealed because continuing forward was no longer an option. News traveled quickly once the doors were opened, not publicly, but through private calls and messages among those who understood the history. The reactions weren't excitement or nostalgia, they were cautious. People asked what had been uncovered, then just as quickly clarified what hadn't. That distinction mattered, because hidden within this space was more than outdated equipment. It was proof of a moment when progress fractured, when stepping away felt safer than finishing. Murder Nova stood at the center of it, fully aware that reopening the garage also reopened questions left unanswered. This place had never been forgotten. It had been deliberately avoided. And now that it stood open again, whatever truth had been sealed inside was no longer contained. What still remained. What caught Murder Nova's attention first was not how old the equipment was, but the purpose still embedded in it. This was not a pile of discarded parts shoved aside for convenience. It was a functioning workspace brought to a sudden standstill, a place where progress had been interrupted rather than finished. The layout itself told a story that went beyond metal and tools, a narrative of momentum cut short instead of naturally concluded. Shelves sagged under the weight of components that had once been carefully organized, only to be abandoned without ceremony. Handwritten labels still clung to bins, listing tolerances and configurations that never reached the track. Some parts were untouched, others partially altered, suggesting choices made and then left hanging. In racing, unfinished work is uncommon, because unfinished work usually represents opportunity lost. At the center of the garage sat the build that refused to fade into the background. It had not been stripped, scavenged, or repurposed. It remained preserved in its half-completed form, as if leaving it intact had been deliberate. The setup was bold and experimental, unlike anything ever raced publicly. This was not a backup plan. It was a clear direction. The longer the space was examined, the more unsettling the details became. A timing chart pinned to the wall ended mid-session, its final numbers smeared but readable. A fuel map showed repeated revisions, each pass tighter than the last, before stopping abruptly. These were not signs of retreat. They pointed to escalation, to boundaries being tested rather than abandoned. Near the back of the garage, a workbench held a stack of notebooks that had not been disturbed. They were not standard logs. They read like contingency outlines, mapping scenarios and adjustments for conditions that never arrived. The language was exact, urgent, and incomplete. Pages ended mid-thought, as if the writer had been pulled away instead of choosing to stop. What made the scene unsettling was not any single object, but the pattern formed when everything was viewed together. This garage had been preparing for something important, something demanding secrecy, speed, and control. The sudden halt suggested outside pressure, not second thoughts. Projects are usually abandoned when they fail. This one had not failed yet. There were also items that felt out of place, parts sourced from suppliers that no longer existed, components fabricated in shops that never reproduced them. These were one-off investments, the kind made only when continuation is expected. Their presence implied confidence right up until the door was closed. As Murder Nova moved through the space, what was missing stood out as clearly as what remained. There were no signs of cleanup or preparation for storage. Personal belongings were gone, removed deliberately, while the work was left untouched. It felt as though someone had taken only what was needed to leave, leaving the rest behind as something they did not want to face again. That realization sharpened the unease. Garages are abandoned when circumstances force an exit, not when someone plans to return. The careful removal of personal traces suggested intention, while the abandoned work suggested urgency. Those impulses rarely coexist unless something has gone wrong. The silence in the garage felt different, shaped by expectation rather than neglect. Dust lay evenly across surfaces, undisturbed by later visits. There were no signs of scavenging or curiosity. This space had been deliberately avoided by those who understood its history. Once word spread quietly that the garage had been opened, messages began to arrive. No one asked what had been discovered. They asked whether anything had been moved. That question revealed more than intended. It suggested familiarity with what remained, at least in outline, and implied that disturbing it carried risk. The conclusion was unavoidable. What had been left behind was not merely outdated equipment, but a frozen moment tied to decisions made under pressure. Murder Nova recognized that reopening the garage had already shifted something. The past was no longer sealed. Whatever had been contained here was now open to interpretation, speculation, and consequence. The space had kept its silence for years. Now it was speaking through what it had preserved. What still remained did not provide direct answers. It offered fragments, pointing toward a story deliberately set aside. And as those fragments began to align, it became clear that understanding why the garage was abandoned would mean confronting choices no one wanted to explain when they were made. The door was open, the evidence was still there, and the questions were no longer theoretical. Why the garage was left silent. Understanding why the garage remained sealed for so many years means returning to a chapter most people preferred to remember only in pieces. For Murder Nova, that era was shaped not by a single defining moment, but by steady accumulation. Pressure did not arrive suddenly. It gathered gradually, layer after layer, until the gap between ambition and consequence narrowed almost completely. During that time, the competitive landscape around Street Outlaws was shifting fast. Racing grew quicker, more technical, and far less forgiving. Margins tightened, expectations rose, and tolerance for error disappeared. What had once been driven by creativity and nerve was evolving into something closer to an arms race, where restraint looked like weakness and escalation was treated as proof of commitment. Within that environment, the project housed in the old garage represented a true leap forward. It was not an incremental change or refinement. It marked a directional turn, one that would have placed Murder Nova on an entirely different path. The build stretched limits not only of performance, but of explanation. It required confidence not just in what it could do, but in how those results could be defended once achieved. That difference mattered more than it seemed. As competition intensified, scrutiny followed. Much of it stayed out of view. Conversations shifted to the margins, quieter and more careful than before. Curiosity slowly sharpened into concern. Suppliers hesitated. Insurance discussions took on a different tone. Individually, these signs were easy to dismiss. Together, they formed a clear warning. The garage became the center of that tension. It held work that was ahead of its time, but also beyond the comfort of the system around it. Innovation alone is celebrated. Innovation that forces others to confront questions they are unready to answer becomes risky. Timing made everything volatile. Momentum was building, and success felt close. Walking away then seemed almost self-destructive. Yet that same momentum left little room for adjustment. Once certain thresholds were crossed, slowing down would no longer be possible without exposure. Those close to the situation remember a narrow window where choices still existed. continue forward and accept whatever followed, or stop and absorb the loss privately. The second option offered no praise, no closure, and no easy explanation. But it preserved something far more important than a single season's success. It preserved control. The decision to leave the garage was not viewed as defeat, it was viewed as containment. By freezing the project exactly where it stood, risk stayed confined instead of spreading. No results meant no explanations were required. Absence became protection. That choice explains the strange condition of the space. Work stopped mid-process not from neglect, but from urgency. Cleaning up would have taken time. Dismantling would have created trails. Leaving everything untouched reduced movement and limited questions. Personal belongings were removed with care. Anything tying people emotionally to the space was taken, while the work itself remained. That separation allowed everyone to move forward without the pull of return. The garage was not erased, it was paused. Over time, the story softened, details faded, priorities shifted. The garage turned into a reference without substance, spoken of but never examined. That vagueness protected everyone involved. Less specificity meant less risk, but ambiguity carries its own cost. It invites speculation, and speculation reshapes memory. What had once been restraint risked being reframed as indecision. That threat lingered quietly until the door finally opened. Standing inside years later, Murder Nova could see what had been unclear then. The abandonment had been deliberate, not reactive. It was ambition placed beneath responsibility, not because ambition was wrong, but because its consequences had exceeded the structure meant to contain them. The garage preserved that moment without distortion. Nothing had been cleaned up or reframed. It showed escalation halted by choice. Reopening the space forced a reckoning, not publicly, but personally. Time had validated the decision. Racing had grown more regulated and less tolerant of gray space. What might have been defended once would not have been later. The shutdown also explained changes that followed. Builds became clearer, methods easier to explain. Risk shifted away from ambiguity toward measurable performance. These shifts were often called evolution. In truth, they were corrections informed by proximity to a line that could not be crossed safely. What made this clarity difficult was recognizing how close everything had come to tipping. This was not failure narrowly avoided. It was collapse delayed through discipline. Discipline rarely earns applause in worlds that reward bravado. Standing there, Murder Nova understood that stopping had preserved agency. Continuing would have surrendered control to forces indifferent to intent. The garage was not unfinished business. It had already served its purpose. Understanding why the garage was abandoned meant accepting that not every victory is visible. Some victories are measured by disasters that never occur, by careers that continue, and by communities that survive. The garage was left closed because it needed to be, not forever, but long enough. Time dulled the danger and widened perspective. The door could open now because the moment it held no longer threatened the present. What once required silence could now withstand clarity. The abandonment was not the end. It was the pause that made everything else possible. Reckoning with what was left. Standing within the reopened garage, Murder Nova realized this moment was no longer about parts or past builds. It was about answering to a version of himself he had intentionally stepped away from. The space did not resemble a forgotten workshop. It felt more like a conversation placed on hold, waiting patiently for its owner to return and finally address it. He moved carefully through the room, recognizing choices he once defended and others he had quietly set aside. Each unfinished adjustment, every note scratched out and revised, marked a moment when instinct had pushed ahead of restraint. Back then, those decisions felt required, even justified. Preserved in place, they now carried added gravity. What unsettled him was not regret, but perspective. Years of distance had stripped away adrenaline and replaced it with clarity. He could now see how narrowly the project had skirted a confrontation no amount of on-track success could have softened. The garage held that closeness intact, almost uncomfortably so. For a long time, he explained the shutdown with simple reasoning. The moment passed. Focus changed. Circumstances intervened. None of that was untrue, but it was incomplete. Standing there, he confronted the fuller reality. He stepped away because continuing would have demanded explanations he was not prepared to give. The version of himself he faced was not reckless, but absolute. It required full commitment, not just to winning, but to standing behind the process that delivered those wins. That level of commitment compresses margins in a discipline where margins are already thin. At the time, retreat felt like loss. In retrospect, it read as restraint. He could now trace much of his later approach back to that choice. Subsequent builds were cleaner, more transparent, intentionally defensible. What others called growth now looked more like correction. There was another realization, harder still. Walking away had shielded more than his own career. It had protected those around him from being drawn into explanations they never asked for. The garage had absorbed risk so it would not spread. That insight reframed the discomfort of reopening it. The unease did not come from fear of discovery, but from understanding why the space had remained untouched. It marked a boundary that had once been essential and was now being crossed with purpose. He felt no urge to dismantle or erase what remained. Doing so would have been dishonest. The space mattered because it told the truth without revision. Opening the garage was not about reviving an old project. It was about acknowledging a chapter that shaped everything afterward. Avoidance had served its role. Understanding now required engagement. He also knew others would read the reopening differently. Some would see nostalgia, others would see danger. A few would hear the warning in the silence. He no longer felt compelled to manage those interpretations. This reckoning was inward, not public. It required no defense, only acceptance. The garage had been closed because it needed to be. Opening it now did not change that. It allowed the truth to exist without threat. The past no longer tempted, it informed. That difference mattered. Some doors are closed to protect what is inside. Others are closed to protect what lies beyond. This one had done both. The aftermath that followed. The decision to reopen the garage did not ripple through the Street Outlaws world as breaking news or public confrontation. Instead, it traveled the way genuine disruption always does in close communities, quietly, through private texts, guarded phone calls, and half-spoken conversations where everyone understood more than anyone said aloud. The fallout was never about drama, it was about memory. For those who had lived through the era, the garage represented, the reaction was instant and visceral. That space was more than a physical location. It marked a line once drawn, a reminder of how far things had pushed before restraint stepped in. Opening that boundary again forced people to reconsider assumptions they had long stopped questioning. Veteran racers responded with restraint and weight. No one asked why the garage had been closed. They already knew the answer. The real question was why it had been opened now. In this environment, timing is never accidental. Reopening the space signaled that whatever danger once required silence had either faded with time or shifted into something survivable. For younger racers, the reaction carried a different tone. They had inherited the garage only as rumor, an unresolved piece of history without texture or proof. Seeing it reopened turned folklore into substance. The effect was grounding. It reframed progress, illustrating that advancement does not always move forward in a straight line, and that some limits are not set by rulebooks, but by lived consequence. Inside shops and trailers, teams began revisiting conversations that had never fully ended. Builders recalled ideas they had walked away from without explanation. Racers reflected on moments when momentum had quietly changed direction without protest. The garage gave those decisions meaning they lacked when they were first made. What unsettled many was how recognizable the pattern felt. Escalation followed by silence. Innovation pressing into gray areas. Then a hard stop that everyone accepted without demanding clarity. The garage made one thing undeniable. This was not an isolated episode. It was a recurring response to pressure, repeated in different forms across the community. Promoters and organizers observed prayerfully, offering no public reaction. Their concern was not controversy, but trajectory. When old boundaries resurface, oversight follows, and oversight reshapes everything. For years, the garage had remained a closed chapter that allowed progress without revisiting uncomfortable compromises. Opening it disrupted that quiet arrangement. Within teams, the fallout appeared as caution. Builders became more deliberate with documentation. Experiments were debated openly instead of buried quietly. This shift did not come from fear, but from awareness. The garage showed that avoiding explanation does not erase consequence. It only postpones it. Murder Nova noticed this shift in how others responded to him. There was little curiosity, no congratulations. Instead, there was acknowledgement. Short messages that said everything without asking anything. That recognition mattered more than praise. Some felt exposed by the reopening, not because they had crossed lines, but because the garage reminded them how close the entire scene had come to outcomes no one wanted to manage publicly. The discomfort came not from fear of discovery, but from recognition. Fans sensed the change without understanding it. Online discussion flared briefly with speculation, then faded when no spectacle followed. The absence of sensational revelation frustrated those seeking scandal. but it preserved the gravity of the moment. This was never a story for consumption. It was a story about limits. The real impact came through recalibration. The garage reopened a conversation about sustainability in a culture that often glorifies immediacy. It quietly reinforced the truth that survival depends as much on judgment as on speed. Veteran builders used the moment as instruction. They spoke more honestly with younger teams about why some paths are abandoned without ceremony. These were not warnings, but explanations delayed for years. The garage gave those lessons weight. Restraint, once mistaken for caution, emerged as strategy. Walking away at the right time preserved careers and protected the community. Success without explanation began to lose its appeal. Transparency gained value, not as vulnerability, but as protection. The garage reframed it that way. Most importantly, the reopening did not weaken the Street Outlaws world. It strengthened it. By restoring shared memory, flattened by time, it reinforced collective responsibility. Murder Nova's refusal to exploit the moment set the tone. He sought understanding, not leverage. As the days passed, tension settled into something steadier. The garage became a reference point, spoken of with gravity rather than excitement. The fallout did not create new rules. It reminded everyone why the old ones existed. It did not introduce fear. It restored context. And that context was what allowed ambition, creativity, and speed to continue without turning inward and destroying the very community that depended on them.
That was the true fallout. Not outrage, but clarity.
The truth that could no longer stay buried. By the time the final conversations faded and the garage door remained open without ritual or announcement, it was obvious that what had been revealed could never be closed again. The truth contained within that space was not explosive or scandalous, but it was enduring. It lingered in changed behavior, in newly respected limits, and in a shared awareness of how close everything had once come to falling apart. For Murder Nova, that persistence carried both a sense of relief and a renewed sense of obligation. The garage did not uncover a crime, nor did it expose a single catastrophic moment. What it revealed was far more unsettling for people whose lives revolve around speed, ingenuity, and risk. It revealed restraint exercised under pressure, the kind of restraint that rarely receives praise because it leaves behind no trophies or measurable wins. Walking away does not produce headlines, it produces silence. That silence, however, has safeguarded more than personal reputations. It has protected an entire ecosystem that allows underground racing culture to function and survive. When escalation outpaces explanation, scrutiny arrives quickly, and scrutiny rarely distinguishes innovation from recklessness. The garage marked the exact point where that escalation had been deliberately halted, even though the cost was personal and immediate. As the implications settled in, Murder Nova began to see the reopening of the space differently. For years, the garage had represented something unresolved, a chapter paused without conclusion. Now it stood as evidence of judgment applied at the most critical moment. That reframing was not easy to accept. Racing culture celebrates perseverance, the refusal to quit, the instinct to push beyond resistance. Acknowledging that stopping had been the correct decision ran counter to everything that mythology promotes. Yet the physical reality of the garage made any alternative interpretation impossible. Continuing would have demanded justifications that could not endure, explanations that would have drawn others into consequences they never agreed to face, and risks extending far beyond a single build or career. What refused to remain hidden was not danger alone, but accountability. The garage made it clear that at a certain point, responsibility outweighed ambition. That recognition forced a deeper examination of what strength actually looks like in environments built on bravado. Within the broader Street Outlaws circle, similar realizations began to take hold quietly. The reopening acted less as a revelation and more as permission. It allowed others to revisit decisions they had buried, projects set aside without explanation, and boundaries established silently. In that sense, the garage became a mirror rather than an isolated case. Its influence was subtle but lasting. Builders grew more thoughtful about how far they pushed innovation without safeguards. Racers spoke more openly about ideas that never progressed beyond discussion, not because they lacked potential, but because they lacked defensibility. There was no crackdown, no public reckoning, no list of new rules. What emerged instead was collective recalibration shaped by memory rather than mandate. For Murder Nova, that recalibration manifested as clarity rather than regret. He no longer felt compelled to describe the past decision as circumstantial or temporary. It was definitive, and that finality carried dignity. The garage had served its function once by staying closed, and again by being reopened. Both moments were necessary. He also understood that the truth embedded there resisted simplification. It did not conform to a story of victory or failure. It lived in the uncomfortable space between, where choices are made without applause, and outcomes are measured by what never happens. That lack of clean resolution frustrated some observers. People prefer stories with clear heroes and villains, clean endings, and dramatic turns. The garage offered none of that. It offered context. Context rarely satisfies curiosity, but it sustains communities. As time passed, the garage itself began to change again, not through erasure, but through acknowledgement. Items were logged rather than removed. Notes were preserved instead of discarded. The space transitioned from secret to archive, holding lessons rather than liabilities. This shift mattered deeply. It signaled that the past no longer needed to be hidden to be managed responsibly. Transparency, even when incomplete, diminished the power of speculation. Once understood, the truth lost its threat. The most enduring impact, however, lay in how the racing community internalized what the garage represented. Speed without boundaries is not freedom, it is exposure. The garage reinforced that longevity depends as much on knowing when to pull back as on knowing when to press forward. Murder Nova carried that lesson deliberately into every decision that followed. It shaped his collaborations, his builds, and his willingness to articulate limits rather than disguise them. In doing so, he shifted the narrative from avoidance to intention. The truth that refused to stay buried did not demand punishment or public reckoning. It demanded recognition. Recognition that some victories are invisible, defined by absence rather than presence. The absence of catastrophe, the absence of collapse, the absence of explanations no one should ever be forced to give. In that sense, the garage had always told the truth. It had simply waited for the moment when that truth could be heard without destabilizing everything around it. That moment arrived not because circumstances changed, but because understanding did. The door that once needed to remain closed had fulfilled its purpose. Opening it did not rewrite history, it contextualized it. The truth emerged not as scandal, but as instruction. And instruction, once absorbed, reshapes the future more quietly and more effectively than any warning ever could. What surfaced here was never meant to shock, and that is precisely why it matters. This is not a story about what was found, but about why it was left untouched for so long, and what restraint truly costs in a world built on risk. If you want to understand the moments that shape outcomes without ever making headlines, stay with this series. Subscribe, follow, and keep watching, because the truths that matter most are often the ones that almost stayed buried. In the end, this was never about a garage, a build, or a moment frozen in time. It was about the discipline to stop when stopping carried a greater cost than pushing forward. Some stories end with trophies, others end with restraint. And the ones that matter most are often the ones that never make noise when the decision is made. What was left behind did not demand resurrection, it demanded understanding. And now that understanding exists, not as regret, but as clarity, the past no longer needs to be hidden, and it no longer needs to be chased. It has taken its place as context. Stay with the story, because the most important lessons are rarely the loudest ones.